Good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. So glad you've joined me for today's devotion. We are in the Old Testament prophet of Zephaniah. So go ahead and be opening your Bible to the book of Zephaniah, chapter 1. And while you're doing that, just want to remind you that Vacation Bible School is just around the corner here at First Baptist. It'll be June 4 through 8, Sunday evening through Thursday evening, 6:30 to 8:30. If you have not yet registered your children for Vacation Bible School, do so today. Go to the church website and just follow the link there for VBS and register your kids today. All right, Zephaniah. Zephaniah was a prophet during the early years of King Josiah's rule as king in Judah. And you'll remember we've just been reading about Josiah back in 2 Kings, and he was a really good king, a godly king, and God delayed the judgment that was coming to Judah until after Josiah had died peacefully. And then later, just a few years later, the judgment came. Well, Zephaniah was a prophet probably before Josiah led all of that religious renewal. Remember the reforms that he made and the repairing of the temple and getting rid of all the idols and the places where idols had been worshiped and so on, and reinstituting the Jewish Passover. Well, Zephaniah was a prophet during the time frame leading up to that religious reform. And he talks in chapter 1 about Israel's sin, or Judah's sin, and the destruction that was coming to Jerusalem and Judah at the hand of the Babylonians, and why they were being judged. An interesting note is that Zephaniah and King Josiah were distant relatives. You'll remember that King Hezekiah, a previous godly king who led a religious reform, was Josiah's great-grandfather. Well, that same Hezekiah was Zephaniah's great-great-grandfather, so they were distant cousins, if you will. And I want you to notice how Zephaniah describes the destruction that is coming to the kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. In chapter 1 of Zephaniah, in verse 4, God says, "I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem." So God says, my hand is not going to be there to protect you, to help you, to bless you. My hand is going to be there to discipline, to punish you. Dropping down to verse 13. Verse 13, God, through the prophet Zephaniah, says, "Moreover, their wealth will become plunder." In other words, the Babylonian nation will take all of their wealth from them, and their houses desolate. Yes, they will build houses, but not inhabit them, plant vineyards, but not drink their wine. They're going to build these houses, they're going to plant these vineyards, but they will be conquered and deported, and they will not get to enjoy those houses or the wine that comes from those vineyards. And then in verse 14, "Near is the great day of the Lord, near and coming very, very quickly." In fact, the destruction in Judah started probably within 20 years of Zephaniah's preaching. And he goes on to describe it in vivid, painful detail in the verses that follow. And what is their sin? I mean, the book of Kings, the prophetess Huldah, others have already pointed it out many, many times, but Zephaniah describes it as well in chapter 1. Just some of what he says about their sin that brought about this judgment from God. Verse 4, where he says, "I will stretch out my hand," etc. And notice at the end of verse 4, "And the names," he's going to destroy the names of the idolatrous priest. The priest of God were not faithful to God and led people in idol worship. And then there were other false priests that were raised up for these pagan religions that the Jewish people in the nation of Judah followed. He goes on in verse 5, "Those who bow down on the housetop to the host of heaven, and those who bow down and swear to the Lord, yet swear by Milcom," or another name for that god is Molech, a fire god. And they would often sacrifice children to that fire god. And so they bowed down on the top of their houses to this pagan, evil deity, god, idol. And he said in verse 5 that they bowed down and swear to the Lord, and then they swear to the mixing of worship of their God with these pagan religions. We call that in history and theology syncretism, where you blend together. And folks, that's America today. A little bit of Christianity and a little bit of everything else. And there's too many people going to church. I'm going to worship Jesus, but I'm going to worship all this other stuff too. And it doesn't. God never approves that. Never accepts that. In verse 6 he says, in fact, when you do that, you do what they did. And what they did in verse 6 was they turned their back from following the Lord. So when you mix other philosophies and you mix other religions and other idols and whatever with Jesus, with God, you turn your back on God, because God never tolerates that kind of watered down, compromised religion. He just doesn't. And their attitude in verse 12, God saying to the prophet, to them, it will come about at that time, the time of judgment, that I will search Jerusalem with lamps. It's like us going through a dark place with a flashlight so we can see. God says, I'm going to look and I will see, and I will punish the men who are stagnant in spirit. You ever been stagnant in your spiritual life? These stagnant men who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good or evil. In other words, God's not going to do anything. God's not going to do anything good for us. But hey, God's not going to do anything evil for us either. God, yeah, we believe in Him, we worship Him, but we serve materialism and we serve this philosophy, and we kind of blend it all together and create our own thing, because God's not going to do anything good or bad. Zephaniah, describing the attitude of the people of Judah in the days leading up to their destruction by the Babylonians, I think, is describing so many people in America today, and unfortunately, too many people who go to church or used to go to church and claim to be followers of Jesus, but they mix Jesus with everything coming and going, and they don't think God's going to do anything. And boy, are they wrong. The question is, are you wrong? Are you mixing Jesus? Are you mixing Jesus with all this other stuff and thereby turning your back on Him? Or are you sold out to Jesus, all in with Jesus? That's where we need to be. Hey, God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 3 of Zephaniah.